Welcome, everyone. I'm Sonja Thompson, Senior Strategist for Huawei USA and the moderator of today's webinar, COVID-19 Connectivity and Community. Now, this is a really important topic because a lot of people's lives have shifted over the past couple of months with the pandemic impacting how we work, how we play, and in a very broad sense, how we communicate with the world around us. Joining the conversation today, I'm very pleased to introduce the following three speakers who are all experts in their fields. We have Scott Jamar, who is the VP of Industry Relations for Huawei USA, Debra Ruh, the CEO and founder of Ruh Global and a disability rights advocate extraordinaire, and Pete Settelmayer, the VP and Executive Director of City Year San Jose. Now, first of all, I want to thank you all for connecting here, Scott, Debra, Pete, and I want to thank all the people who are tuning in either in real time or on demand. This is part of the connectivity that we're talking about today. And a quick note that we are providing closed captions, which you'll be able to find on the toolbar at the bottom. If we can go to the next slide that shows the agenda for today, we'll start our conversation talking about the shift of how we're connecting with others during this pandemic, with shelters in place and mandated social distancing, and how we're adjusting to a COVID-19 world. We'll take a look at connectivity in the United States, including areas that aren't connected or don't have access. The importance of connectivity for communities, including people with disabilities, the disabled community, and students, the educational community. Then we'll discuss some of the ways we can strengthen our community ties right now. Last but certainly not least, we'll open up for audience Q&A. Please feel free to ask questions from our speakers at any point during the conversation. We hope that we'll be able to answer everyone's questions then, but our speakers will also be available for 30 minutes right after the webinar to answer questions in real time on Huawei USA's Twitter channel. So we will welcome and encourage everyone to continue the conversation there. Okay, so I'd like to begin by getting some insights from Scott, who I had the pleasure of traveling with quite a bit before COVID-19. And I know that quite a few people like us are now working from our home offices. Yet as the VP of Industry Relations, Scott, you still have to arrange meetings with colleagues, think tanks, key opinion leaders, and government folks. From a business perspective, can you tell us about the shift and some of the challenges that you've faced?
Sure, we have the next slide. So, before COVID, a lot of us traveled all over the world pretty regularly. It's interesting to see that, just a year ago, TSA screened, 2.21 million people a day in US airports, and now it's down to about 87,000. It's a drop of more than 95%. And that's created a real challenge for a lot of us in how to change how we work, how we interact with each other, how we communicate. Many of our days have become basically 18 to 20 hours a day on telepresence calls or virtual meetings. And, in the beginning, I thought I had a really great home office. And this virus has really exposed the gaps in my coverage here. And it's really made me think more about how can I improve my ability to communicate with everyone. And going on to the next point, virtual meetings, of course, have skyrocketed. Zoom is reporting 300 million daily participants, up from about 10 million in December. And it's also changed our views on those types of platforms, and I'll cover that in the next slide. But one of the things that has come out of this is that working adults in the US, 41% of the people are afraid to go back to work. It's going to be the new normal for a while, but even when I'm watching movies now, I have social distancing in mind. So if I'm watching a movie where people are too close, I cringe a little bit. I think, oh no, separate yourselves. Don't do that. But it's really changed the way we're thinking about this. People are going to be scared to go to work, take their car to be fixed, or heaven forbid, call an Uber. I don't know if any of you have seen the Uber videos where they've got the entire back seat plastic off. You feel like almost you're getting into some kind of murder scene. And that creates a lot of problems for people, but it's creating a shift in the way we think about things. And it's going to be really interesting once this is flattened, so we can all start trying to get back to normal again. But we're always going to have that thought in the back of our head, what am I doing? Am I too close to somebody? So it has created a new normal and a different mindset that people are thinking. And then, telemedicine has been taking off. I mean, we've been talking about the promise of telemedicine for years, but COVID has just shoved it front and center. In fact, I had my own first checkup with my doctor on my iPhone a few weeks ago, and they were telling me that, I was the first person that they successfully had a checkup with. So that just kind of goes to the digital literacy. Even our medical professionals are learning how to adjust to this new world that we live in. Can we go to the next slide? So we've got a couple of challenges in this new world, and one of them is, what platform do we use? What technology do we use? We've got Zoom, we've got Skype, we've got Microsoft Teams, we've got Google Meetings. Which ones of those are the best ones to use for your particular needs and your particular company? And then, can the people you work with in the company support that? A lot of the virtual meeting companies have made their services free now, and they're making them somewhat easier to use. But that ties into digital literacy. I thought I was pretty good at this stuff until we started having to do this every single day. But I think some of the things that we all need to think about with these, we need to know, does the service have end-to-end encryption? Are they testing the encryption? Do they offer multi-factor authentication? What about privacy? One of the things that I've been looking at here is, when we use Zoom, is enabling a password on each of my meetings to make sure that I don't get Zoom bombed, which is the new thing apparently these days. And they've also added longer meeting numbers and meeting identifiers to help protect us and help with our privacy. So I think those are things that are important, and also becoming adept at using these platforms. So, that's a really critical part, and I hope everybody's thinking about those things as they're putting together their strategy on how they're going to communicate. Can we go to the next slide? We'll talk about the next challenge. So the big one, America's digital divide, the haves and the have-nots. We know that from FCC broadband maps that they state that 98.1% of Americans have access to fixed terrestrial broadband, and 89.7 Americans living in rural areas have the connectivity. In California, it's not as good, but what we found out in looking at this, if we can go to the next slide, is that the rural broadband maps are actually woefully inadequate and inaccurate. Most people don't realize that when a carrier states that they provide broadband coverage in a particular area, they use census blocks and zip codes to determine where they have coverage. The problem is, if only one person in a particular area has broadband, then the entire block is considered to have broadband, which is completely inaccurate. And living up here in the Santa Cruz Mountains, I'm on that downside. I've got DSL, and I count myself lucky. For a lot of people, especially in rural areas, don't. And the rural connectivity is a really critical part for Americans to be able to live and work and survive and buy groceries in this new world that we live in. I mean, it was already a challenge before. It's even more of a challenge now. And this is something that Huawei, for example, has decades of experience in building rural broadband networks around the world in over 170 countries for over 30 years. And the larger carriers just don't look at these rural areas because they don't generate enough money. They don't know how to change their business model to be profitable in a rural market. Whereas Huawei knows this cold. We've been doing this, as I said, for over 30 years. We can set these networks up and spec them out really easily because our systems are made to scale up, whereas the other systems for larger metropolitan areas are designed not to scale down, but to continue to scale up. So there's some real challenges in rural broadband coverage that Huawei could really help with within our rural broadband communities, and do it to the point where everybody gets great coverage and it's profitable. So I think this is a good segue, Sonja, for Debra to pick up, because she also has coverage issues.
Debra, I know that you're feeling the pain from this, the rural broadband coverage gap, because you also live in a rural area that has pretty limited and unstable internet. And I think you also have a unique perspective in that you're a business owner. So how important is connectivity for your organization, Ruh Global? And what are some of the difficulties that you've experienced as a business owner that are perhaps unique to these times that we're living in right now?
And thank you so much for Huawei for inviting me to be on the program. I appreciate that you're working to get information out during the crisis. So thank you for this information. I was really fascinated with the map that Scott was just showing because unfortunately I am orange, purple and orange, but I live outside Richmond, Virginia in Rockville. So I live in rural Virginia, and unfortunately, I happen to live in a place where we don't have access to the internet in the traditional ways. And so what we've had to do, because I work from home, my entire team works from their homes, and we have for many years. But the reality is, it's very difficult to work from home, as we're all finding out, if you don't have good connectivity. And and as you said, Sonja, I'm a small business, so I need reliable, affordable internet. Otherwise, the digital divide continues to widen, and many people live in rural communities because they can't always. I choose to live in rural America, but some people live in these rural communities because they can't afford urban as well. So it's a really big problem. Now, I do have internet. I have a provider. I've written about this, but I have a provider that has band-aided me together. And Huawei was kind enough to actually give my provider some advice. Then fortunately, Huawei can't help us, which I think is really unfortunate for me and all my neighbors. I thought it was interesting what Scott said about if only one person has it, because in my community, there is a line where there are like 5 houses that do have it. So I guess they consider we have it, but we don't. And I have to pay $250 every month, which is, most of my, colleagues or that have access, they generally pay about $100, but I also have to buy all my equipment. So I've spent thousands of dollars as a small business. And I think it's ridiculous that we're not taking care of rural America. But there's also impact to us. We have real impact to us. Our houses are not selling. It is causing lower property values out here. I know my next door neighbor was trying to sell their house, and the first thing people would ask, do you have reliable, quality internet? No. And they couldn't sell their house for 2 years because of that one point. Yeah, maybe you can do it like I've done it and band-aid it together, but it's expensive. If the wind gets too much around here, I have problems, and so we don't have really good options. Small businesses are in big, big trouble all over the world, but certainly here in the United States, small businesses are starting to fold. They're moving. We've actually had businesses move out of our community because they didn't have access to the internet. And so it is really hurting small business in rural America in ways that just with this crisis, it's getting worse and worse and worse. Next slide.
So Debra, I did want to ask you, like a bigger question, and maybe it's more of a philosophical question. In your words, what's the difference between being connected and connectivity?
Yes, and I put a picture of my beautiful daughter up here that was born with Down syndrome, which she's the reason why I do this work. But I'm going to read this for people that might not be able to read it. Connectivity is the ability or means to connect the technology, and being connected is more about engaging and socializing with others on a local, national, and global scale. And so being connected is great, but it actually has to work to connect us to the connectivity. And so, and it seems like a small point, but the community of people with disabilities have been begging our governments and our businesses to be accessible and include us. And thank you, Huawei, for making sure that this meeting is captioned and transcribed, because most of us are watching videos with the sound turned off. And so it's so important that we include everyone. And getting to the next slide, let's talk about people with disabilities and also older people that are, acquiring disabilities for the first times in their lives. This year, we mark our 30th year anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and we've made some great strides, but this crisis has shown us where the big problems, the big gaps are. I was looking at a report the UNESCO did, which thank you for Huawei for supporting UNESCO too, but they were saying that 40% of children are not getting access to schools because of connectivities. And I know we're going to talk about that a little bit later, but this COVID-19 virus has just shown us all the barriers that we face, the lack of accessibility, biases, conscious and unconscious, antiquated laws that still say that if you are a person without a disability, like my daughter, and we only have, access to one piece of needed medical equipment, maybe you're get it over my daughter because she's Down syndrome. We have laws on the books in the United States that are very discriminating and antiquated laws. And then the connectivity issues they're just huge, and they disproportionately impact our disenfranchised parts of our community that are often people with disabilities, people of color. Our diverse populations, once again, are the ones that are being impacted. And as we say, stay at home to stay safe, which I've been doing. I'm doing this from home. I've been trying to follow the rules that are suggested, but children with disabilities and families with disabilities, individuals with disabilities that themselves are caregivers, are struggling to access needed assistive technology, connectivity, the right other technology, and accessible content. And at the same time, ICTs, internet communications and technologies, they have to be integrated as part of society. We can talk about technology, but if we don't have connectivity, the technology does us often no good. We have to have connectivity, and we have to be part of the information society and make it a prerequisite that we all be included. And if you think I'm just a do-gooder and I care about people with disabilities, you're right. But we all know what I'm talking about now, as we were forced home, whether or not you had the connectivity or the technology, no matter if you were part of a rural community, you were forced home. And now I think more people are understanding what we're talking about. Next slide. So ICT does equal access for persons with disabilities. And I'm going to just use a few examples. And there's some wonderful examples out there of how corporations are trying to make a difference for our community. StorySign is a wonderful application that's been downloaded so many times all over the world. I learned from Huawei that 90% of children that are born deaf or have hearing loss are born to hearing parents that don't know sign language. And sign language is a beautiful, complex language. Just to complicate things, there are different types of sign language depending upon where you are. But so StorySign is a wonderful example of taking connectivity and artificial intelligence and putting it together with the community to meet a need. And it won a Cannes Lion Award, which I applaud. Another wonderful example is Be My Eyes. Be My Eyes is this terrific app that was created, but it also has millions of volunteers. So a person that is blind, for example, that's trying to do a day-to-day function, or maybe they're in a hotel room and they're trying to adjust the air conditioning, which I very rarely can figure out how to do in a hotel. But you can use this app and it will connect you to a sighted user. And it's just really, really, really a powerful app tool using artificial intelligence and technology and connectivity and connecting people together so they can help each other. The last example is Track AI, which is changing everything for children that are born or acquire vision loss or blindness early in life. We've been diagnosing these children in the same way for years and years and years. And it's hard sometimes to say, well, can you see this? Well, how about, can you see this? When the reality is maybe they're nonverbal, or maybe they're, they can't tell you what they're really experiencing. So Huawei worked with a small group, Dive Medical, to create this Track artificial intelligence to help doctors do a better job of diagnosing these issues. So technology is something that is so beneficial to the community of people with disabilities and older people that are acquiring disabilities. It is an equalizer, but only if we can be connected and only if we can get access.
Thank you, Deborah. Another really large community that is trying to adapt and shift to an online presence right now is, of course, education. So Pete, we would love to hear a little bit about City Year and how is adjusting to the challenges of COVID-19.
Sure. And thank you, Huawei, for having me on and talking about this very important topic. So City Year, prior to the COVID pandemic, we are in 29 cities throughout the United States with 3,000 AmeriCorps members, serving hundreds of thousands of students in the areas of most need. We often serve in communities that, as Deborah referred to, have been kind of under-resourced and systemically under-resourced for hundreds of years. And so a typical day in the life of a City Year Corps member is that they get to arrive to a public school at 7:30 in the morning with their group, and they'll greet students as they walk on the campus, and then work with teachers and students during the school day. And then after school day, we run a whole after school program based on STEAM. And obviously that all changed for us in California, in San Jose, in March 16th, where we had to quickly kind of move from this in-person service. The first couple of weeks of this, we went from looking at educational support to what do our families need at the beginning of this pandemic. And a lot of it was revolved around food scarcity, making sure that they had food in the house. So we worked with our school districts to make sure that we were there to support food service. Then, technology. So technology is a huge opportunity for our students. So we talk about the digital divide and not access to internet or Wi-Fi, or not access to even the hardware, the technology. So we spent a lot of our time with our school districts getting technology into the students' hands. And still, we spent some amount of that time working with families to get them paper packets because they didn't have access to the internet at home. So it's been a huge opportunity for us. So immediately that service that I talked about earlier went from this in-person service at school to now, how do we train up our AmeriCorps members for virtual service? So a lot of it now is daily online touring sessions. We look at how students are engaged. So at the beginning, we spent a lot of time working with our AmeriCorps members on what does virtual service look like. And not only our AmeriCorps members, but we have teachers, we have parents who there is a digital literacy gap. I always say now that the digital literacy gap is now a chasm because of this pandemic. I think we'll soon see this pandemic go from the ICU to the classrooms, which we'll be experiencing in great ways once schools start to open up again. I think the other thing that we're working with now at City Year is this concept of our AmeriCorps members, who are these young 18 to 25-year-olds who volunteer a year of service to communities in most need. We've always developed leadership styles in them, but now their leadership style has had to be in flux, right? We are working with them in a period of crisis. And how do you manage through crisis? And how do you manage through change? I think we always talk about the theory of change. Well, the theory of change happens daily for our AmeriCorps members as the students that they're working with. They experience daily changes in their life. And then, our next step is to think about what does going back to school look like, and what does social distancing look like, and what does that look like in the schools that we're working in and our partnerships. So we spend a lot of time working with our superintendents and school site leaders on what does that transition look like when it comes to going back to school in the fall or going to a virtual school in the fall, and then maybe practicing those social distancing that I think all schools across the United States will be practicing and learning together.
So Pete, how do you see the future of education changing as a result of this pandemic? And what can parents do right now if they're working from home and their kids are at home, right? Like, how do families find that balance between these two worlds, the work and family, when right now they're so blended?
Yeah, it's a good question. And to answer your first question, I think that education, the need for change in public education has always been a great need. And I think this pandemic has really put a magnifying glass to not those families that are resourced, right? And so when you ask them about how families can support, I think there's 20,000 different answers to that question, right? Because we have resource families that have a mom and a dad or a typical family, right? But then we have single parent families, and we have working poor families. And now we have families who are unemployed. And so how do we support families, or what families can do? It ranges according to what those families are experiencing. And I think it's our biggest opportunity to say, as a country, you know, what are we going to do to raise the bar for those families, and especially families of color, because that's who we've neglected for the longest time. What are we going to do to raise the bar for those families around educational justice and educational equity? And so it's really, I wish I could answer that in one answer, Sonja, what families can do. But quite honestly, for everybody who's out there, all this, the people that are watching right now, there's a different need for those families. You know, I would say for resource families, avoid screen time, right? Talk to them about what's going on beyond what they're learning in school virtually. I think every moment now is a teachable moment. And if we as educators, and we're all educators on this panel and anybody watching, we have to make these teachable moments for our students, for the people that we work with, and then for those who we don't yet know. So not a simple answer to that question, Sonja.
Yeah. One of the last questions that I want to throw out to everyone, not just the speakers today, but even the folks who are tuning in or watching or listening, is how can we strengthen our community ties in the midst of a pandemic? So let me just open this up. Feel free to chime in. People who are watching, feel free to ask a Q&A or to send a comment within that feature.
Well, I'll throw some things out there, some personal observations that I've seen, creative ways of people coping with this and maintaining community. Like I mentioned before, you know, I live up in the Santa Cruz Mountains, Northern California, about half an hour away from Silicon Valley. And most houses here are separated by, you know, 50, 60 yards. So one of the local talk groups said, well, let's have a howl every night at 8 o'clock. So everybody goes outside their house and they howl to encourage solidarity. You know, I saw a really cute video of a father whose son wanted McDonald's for his birthday, a little 4-year-old boy for his birthday. So he went around with a cell phone and recorded going through the closed drive-through of the McDonald's, created a video, and then set up a McDonald's drive-through in his house, and then had his son go through and order his chicken nuggets and then go park in a special place for somebody to come bring them to him. But then he took that video and he shared it with everyone else who wanted to create their own McDonald's drive-through. You know, there's really great organizations that are becoming more and more well-known. You know, the Aspen Institute has something called the Weave Project, where they're going out and working with different people to connect the communities together. And again, they're getting a lot more interest than they were before, because we really do need to support each other through all of this. You know, I'm looking at one of the questions here from one of the attendees. You know, he talks about in Sonoma County, the local libraries are providing mobile Wi-Fi hotspots to people who don't have online access. You know, what are some of the things, those of us are lucky enough to have that, to help other people? Maybe you share your password, or you set up a guest account if you have access and they don't, or you have that ability to. Maybe you have an extra hotspot at home. You know, I've got a T-Mobile hotspot that I use to take with me every now and again. So maybe loaning those devices to people that you know could use them. And if you're in a position to be financially stable enough to do that, maybe start doing that on a larger basis in the neighborhood. But I want to give it back to Sonja and Pete. Pete, looks like you've got some comments there.
Yeah, I was just going to piggyback on what you had to say. I think, we become a disposable society, and I think we can look around our houses and places that we live for things that we see no value in, but there's lots of value to people that don't have it. I think one of the biggest ways to strengthen community now is to really pay attention to what's going on in the world and your local world around you, and get active in those things. I think, there's an opportunity here to reset and do things correctly when we press the restart button. And so I think a lot of it is being an activist for the people that we need to be activists for, reaching alongside of people, not pulling people up, but pulling people alongside of you. Think about getting active politically and making sure that you are speaking up for those issues that need to be spoken up for around access. We know that the biggest opportunity is this digital access, and digital access goes beyond getting technology in people's hands and getting them access to the internet. We also know that there's this huge digital literacy piece. So making sure that when we restart, that we are getting access to those communities that need it most. So,
And this is Deborah. I'd like to come in too. One thing that I'm seeing from the community of people with disabilities is that we are supporting each other. And so often disenfranchised communities, others come in to support them. But I think it's so important when we have our own voices. And so I know some of my team members, for example, who have disabilities themselves. There's this one gentleman, Lamondre, who is an African-American and a man with a physical disability. He is talking to the community and soothing the community. And we see all kind of dance parties happening to entertain and help, people with autism, people with Down syndrome, like my daughter. There's actually been so many different clever events that in that way, it's almost overwhelming also the choices. But I think it's time let our disenfranchised communities speak for themselves as well. And to see the groups like Pete's group that is making such a big difference, and an organization like Huawei that wants to make a difference to the people to make sure we're all connected. There's some really amazing, beautiful stories that are coming out of this, where we're seeing the heroes be the people that typically we thought were disenfranchised, and yet they are doing the most for our communities. And I think we see that on our frontline workers, the people that are bagging groceries and, in the grocery stores and in all of the stores. And there's so many heroes emerging, and many of them are coming from the disenfranchised community. So I agree with you, Pete. This is an opportunity to reset what it means to really include people and value people wherever they are.
Yeah. It really is, Deborah. The connection is critical. And I think this is pointing out even more because we're forced to be apart, but we're still social creatures. We still want to interact. We still want to be able to talk with each other on a regular basis. Waving at my neighbor across the way, I have a nice little conversation with them, but in some ways it's making me appreciate more what we were ignoring, the connections we were ignoring before and just taking for granted. I think I appreciate much more now those connections with those friends that I do stay in touch with. I do want to answer one question though here real quickly, because this is a real critical one. When we do all of this online, how do we stay safe? How do we encourage people to put passwords in their conference calls? And I think it only takes one misstep, one wrong clicked link for that to just make everything fall apart and really cause a problem. So how do we encourage people? We remind them on social media all the time, be safe, use a password, use a longer meeting string to get into it. So just wanted to bring that up.
I'm looking here at the slide that we're showing all of these happy faces. It looks like a happy hour.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that, Scott? It looks like Huawei USA was doing some celebrating via Zoom, which is one of the ways that we've been communicating. Can you talk about that?
Sure. Well, we had a virtual press conference not too long ago, and we provided cocktails to all of the press that was invited. And we all sat around and had a great conversation, and we enjoyed a drink together. There's other apps called House Party where you can actually set up an online party at your home. There's just, an incredible amount of creativity that's coming out of this, where people are trying to find different uses for technology to bring us closer together. And this is a growing trend. And I think we're going to see it grow where we can still maintain our connection. We can still have fun. We've just recently been asked to put together a virtual jam session between our colleagues in China and the ones that are here. There's a few of us that are musicians on the team. So we're kind of looking forward to playing with that. And if we didn't have broadband capability, we wouldn't be able to do that. It would just be a much better experience all around if Huawei could be, a larger broadband provider, especially in the US. Would make a lot of these things just no-brainers. And I'm just really looking forward to all the creativity that people are coming up with to stay connected and to have fun. And if you look at some of the comedians and the shows that we normally watch all the time, they're all shooting these things from home. Production values have gone out the window. What's been important is the message and the communication.
We see that cello in the background, Scott.
You're not going to get a concert today.
I know that as moderator, I just wanted to point out a couple times that I know that there's a lot of different communities. We've only kind of highlighted, a couple large ones today that are really important, but there's people who, have gone to church regularly. So that's the people, and how are they connecting? And I think that there's actually some Zoom communities, people who are actually being able to meet with their congregation and still whatever their faith is, right? Also, a security expert, Craig Spiesel, had a talk with him. He's a big fitness guy. So the fitness community, all the gyms are closed. People are still being able to, I think that he has one of his smart devices where he can actually Zoom and compete with people while he's cycling on his bike. These are the innovations and the things that are still taking place so people can still stay connected, which again, we need connectivity in order to do this. So this is really great. Did anyone else have any suggestions? Is there anybody watching today who would also have any suggestions for how to stay connected right now during this pandemic with their communities? Without any of those, do we have, we're gonna kind of open this up right now for Q&A to the audience, if we can move to that last slide. So let's see what we have. I know that Scott, you had answered a couple.
And it looks like there's one more question we did not answer.
Okay.
It seems clear that much has changed as a result of the pandemic. What long-term changes and how we do business and connect with our communities do you predict will persist even after the pandemic subsides? And since I'm talking, this is Deborah, I will just say, I really know that we're not going back to the way we were, and that's fortunate. We have the chance, and I believe Pete said this, but we have the chance to redefine what our world could look like if we were all truly included and connected. And I know that Scott had also made a comment that he wished that Huawei could be more involved in the US to help us solve some of these problems. I also am really, really hoping that we will do that, because I believe that we're stronger together. We're one people. Let's come together. Let's stop determining that some people don't matter because. And I just think we've got to stop being like that. But let me go back on mute. And Scott, I don't know if you wanted to address this question.
I would jump in too here. And the fact that, I don't know that most people know this, but this March was the only March that there wasn't a school shooting since Columbine. So if we think about, I've been an educator for a long time, and we think about what's changed since Columbine, right? And the fact that school security, we went from, early on in education doing earthquake drills or seasonal drills, right? Tornado drills, to doing lockdown drills. So you think about how the school violence has impacted public education. I think now what will change is kind of for lack of a better term, a Columbine effect now, which is what COVID is doing to public education, and the fact that we weren't ready for virtual learning. We weren't ready to flex that connectivity muscle. And I think now all school systems should be required to make sure that access and resource and digital literacy and that muscle is flexed, and we build up to that. So
yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, COVID-19 has shown a bright white spotlight on the haves and the have-nots, the people that have connectivity and the ones that don't. And we've all realized that we got to have this to survive. I mean, this is not a luxury here. This is like power, water, telephone capabilities, communication capabilities. And I'm hoping that a positive outcome from this will increase the sense of urgency in examining our current policies for where we install rural networks, who's allowed to install rural networks, and open a dialogue and a communication to really start breaking through the logjam and stop sitting back and letting the status quo continue to rule the day. And, oh, well, we can't make enough money off this area because it's too small. Well, that part of it needs to be taken out of the equation or dramatically reduced. There's money that's supposed to be provided to subsidize these rural networks that the government is proposing. Really would like to see those start loosening up and really starting to address some of the communication issues that rural America faces, because that's where the vast majority of our food comes from. That's where the vast majority of our water in different areas. We need the ability to connect everything. And that's the way the world is going. And the longer we resist, the more we're going to be left behind. So I'll get off my soapbox now.
Looks like we got another question that came in. Many people are new to video conferencing. Any suggestions for flattening the learning curve in terms of online etiquette and how it differs from in-person interactions? Or have you not seen this as a challenge?
It's the three things in real estate is location, location, location. I think the three things in video conferencing is practice, practice, practice. I think I get better with each video conference that I'm on and learning the varied platforms. So, yeah,
I would agree. I think all of us can say at a certain level, maybe not including Debra in this, but because she does this all the time, every day. But I think you're right, Pete. It's getting the practice. Spending the time, treating this professionally. Even though you're in your house, potentially in sweatpants, and you're not sharing your video, develop a routine. I have my daily routine that I do, whether or not I'm going in the office or not, and it keeps me sane. That's one reason why I don't have a big bushy beard right now. And you just realize that you're sending your visage out and your message and your discussions out into the ether. And how you present yourself is important. And I think that's a critical issue. And then spending some time just playing with the technology, getting used to it. Call a friend and goof around and have a good time. We're actually seeing a lot of those now where people are doing that. So, but I think Pete summed it up best by just practicing a lot.
And I would just say, this is Debra, I would also say that, we can learn from each other. We need to continue to learn from each other, because my team, many of them being persons with disabilities, we've learned so many things doing this and we're taking the time to share what we know with others. So help each other as you learn something. I know even before we started the webinar today, something came up that we weren't familiar with, and as they solved the problem technically, they were able to tell us what it was, so that if we have that problem. So, and once again, I can't stress enough, everything has to be accessible. And yes, it's for people with disabilities, but accessibility helps all people. So take the time to do it right. Take the time to caption, do transcription. It's going to help everybody. Thank you. I know there's more questions.
I think that one of the things that we're all doing here is we're putting our microphones on mute when other people talk. That's one of the tips that I can think right off the top of my head, or the dog barks in the background, or you can hear the typing right now. We've all been in these meetings where somebody's like, put it on mute. So those are some tips that I can think right off the top. Okay, let's see. I don't know if there's any other, looks like we have one more that has just come in.
We've got a couple. We've got a couple.
Okay, go ahead.
There's a question. The government's looking to address the rural digital divide through the $20 billion RDOF initiative. And we're discussing that this will be inadequate or mistargeted. How do we see the COVID-19 situation affecting the distribution of that, and how would it be sufficient? I think this goes back to the FCC rural broadband maps that are inaccurate, that were provided by the carriers that were allowed to self-report. I think there's a much larger digital divide that we are unaware of at this point because the research hasn't been done. $20 billion, I think it's a good start. I've seen estimates as high as 30 or 40. And it's going to be interesting to see how the government comes back and re-examines what they're doing with rural broadband. Again, it's a much bigger issue now than it ever was before. Before it was just kind of, yeah, we'll get to it when we can, but now we got to get to it and we need to make it happen. And I think that's a really, really good question that a lot of people need to be asking their legislators locally. You know, when am I going to get my rural broadband, and how much is it going to cost me? So we all have a stake in this, and we all need to take some responsibility in raising our voice and saying, look, we need this, and we need it now. We needed it last year, not, you know, so yes. I hope that answered the question, Sean.
And Scott, can I just come in? $20 billion sounds like so much money, but the reality, if we were telling current rural communities that already have Huawei as a solution, and it's an affordable solution, if we're telling this community to pull all that equipment out and start, the money that's going to be lost, the money that's going to be wasted, it doesn't make sense. And so we as Americans need to look at this. And the COVID-19 situation made everything worse. But I agree with you, Scott. We need to go to our senators and our Congress people, and we need to say, this is ridiculous. We're one world. We work better together, and stop demonizing people because it's hurting Americans. Thank you.
It is. And thank you for that. There was another question, how will the emergence of 5G change the connectivity landscape, and how can 5G be made available to every jurisdiction, regardless of whether it's urban or rural? I think the larger carriers are already actively putting out 5G in the US. I don't know if the feature sets are as fully developed as what Huawei is providing to the rest of the world. But 5G, it stands to really help eliminate a lot of this connectivity divide. The ability to have many, many more connections on a single access point. You know, Huawei's 5G solution is a one-to-one replacement, so we don't have to have all the additional antennas installed all around a particular area to provide coverage. So that's one of the things that Huawei has done in 5G innovation, is to make it as unobtrusive but broadly covered as possible. You know, this isn't really a technology discussion, but there's lots of different aspects and features that we've built into our 5G solutions that are really world-class leading and would cover broader areas with much smaller footprint. So I hope that kind of gets there. And to get it everywhere, well, we've got to get governments to understand that cybersecurity by logo is not a viable solution. We need to look at it very closely and to mitigate those concerns, and we're more than happy to talk with them to help work that out. You know, I'm more interested in getting people connected than keeping them disconnected. I hope that answered the question.
Looks like we have another one here that's, there's research out there that says that as many as 40% of people who have broadband access weren't using it before the pandemic. Do you think the growth of video conferencing and distance learning during the pandemic will change this, or will there be a push by some to go back to the status quo, the way things were?
And I'll start. This is Debra, and I think it's very interesting as somebody, I can tell, once again, my internet is band-aided together since we don't have access where I live, but without a lot of black magic going on. I don't even know what they do to bring it to me, but I think that some people will expect it to go back to the status quo, but I don't believe that's going to happen. And you know, and I can always tell. It's interesting at certain times. I know that more people are online. You can tell what time it is. I'm constantly having to reset my system because you can tell people are jumping on. And so it's fascinating, but I think we have to work really, really, really hard to make sure that we don't go back to the old way of doing things, because it wasn't working. It was the normal, but should it have been the normal? So, and I don't know if Pete or Scott want to really answer it a little bit more, but.
Well, I can take a little bit of a stab at it. I think the people that weren't using broadband before had another way around it. They didn't really need to use it, and now they have to. Now it's part of their lives. It's part of their everyday lives. And it'd be really interesting to revisit these statistics after things flatten and after we get back to normal, to see how many people have adopted broadband that do have access to it.
Do we have any other questions come in? I know that I had mentioned before, at the beginning of the webinar, that speakers here today have all agreed to answer questions on Huawei USA's Twitter page. That's at Huawei USA for 30 minutes at the top of the hour. So again, we welcome and encourage everyone to join us there. Are there any other points that any of the speakers today would like to make before we close the session?
No, I would just like to thank Huawei for hosting this panel. I think it's an important discussion. Access will be a continued discussion. It was a discussion before, and you know, it's been magnified because of these events. So I really applaud Huawei for opening this conversation up. So thank you both.
And this is Debra, and I agree. I keep saying we're stronger together, but we really are stronger together. We shouldn't let our borders, our politics stop us from protecting people and helping people, you know, become the best people that they can be. So we've got to work hard to make sure everyone is included, everyone is educated. We've got to really focus on what we need to solve in the world, and stop being so distracted by politicians and haters and things like that. We're human beings. We need to support each other.
I think I'd add to that as well, and appreciate your participation. This is an important topic, and hopefully it's helping spur a conversation. It's making people think about, you know, their place in the world after this, and how we're much better together than we are apart. And, you know, what brings us together, you know, connects us, not divides us. So I really appreciate the opportunity to actually be at Huawei and be able to get some of these messages and some of these stories out and highlight some of the great work, Debra, that you're doing, and Pete, that you're doing. You know, we don't really get too many opportunities to thank you guys on the front lines. And I just want to say thank you for helping us out and helping get those messages.
Wonderful. Okay, you guys, I guess we'll switch over to the Twitter feed for the next half hour. That's at Huawei USA on Twitter, where Debra, Pete, and Scott and myself will all be to answer anybody's questions or to engage and continue the conversation. So thanks again, everyone, the speakers and the audience today. Stay safe and stay connected. Bye-bye.
Thank you.